Summer 1944, somewhere over France. A single fighter plane drops to 60 feet above rolling farmland, so low the propeller kicks dust off wheat fields. 6 German fighters dive after her, their wing-mounted cannons blazing. Inside her cockpit, 20-year-old Zena Wilson isn't running. She's calculating. Through the crackle of German radio frequencies, a panicked voice cuts through. She's flying too low, we can't hit her. Every instinct says climb. Every regulation demands altitude. This pilot keeps descending. The year is 1944, and the skies over Europe have become a hunting ground. German fighter squadrons, veteran aces with dozens of kills each, patrol the routes where Allied pilots ferry fresh aircraft from England to frontline bases. These ferry pilots, flying alone and unarmed, are considered easy prey. Some don't even make it past the Channel. The Women Airforce Service Pilots, WASPs, were told their job was simple: deliver the planes and stay out of combat. They weren't warriors, they were couriers in flight suits. The military brass saw them as capable enough to fly but too fragile for the real war. Most of America saw them the same way. Zena Wilson saw something else entirely when she looked at the sky. To her, flight wasn't about following orders or staying in formation. It was about understanding the physics of metal, air, and gravity. The daughter of an aircraft mechanic, she'd grown up with grease under her fingernails and the sound of radial engines in her ears. She could feel when a plane was about to stall the way most people could feel their own heartbeat. Her instructors at Sweetwater Training Base had written her up twice for unnecessary low-level maneuvers. What they called reckless, she called responsive. What they called showing off, she called testing limits. But limits, she'd learned, were just numbers on paper until you pushed against them. Now, at 20 years old, flying alone over hostile territory in an unarmed P-51 Mustang, those limits would be tested in a way no training manual could prepare her for. Because 6 of Germany's most decorated fighter pilots had just spotted her, and they thought she'd be an easy kill. They were about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous pilot in the sky is the one who has nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The German pilots called them Transportjäger, transport hunters. It was a term that carried both contempt and opportunity. Why waste fuel and ammunition on heavily armed bomber formations when you could pick off lone aircraft ferrying fresh fighters from English airfields to combat squadrons on the continent? The mathematics were elegant. 1 kill, 1 less Allied fighter at the front. No escorts, no return fire, no risk. By the summer of 1944, Luftwaffe intelligence had mapped every major ferry route across the Channel and into occupied France. They knew the altitudes, the typical flight times, the weather windows when ferry missions launched. Squadron commanders would position their hunting packs along these invisible highways in the sky, waiting like wolves at a mountain pass. A lone aircraft, probably piloted by an inexperienced ferry driver more worried about navigation than combat, made for a simple addition to any pilot's tally. The WASPs were particularly vulnerable because of what they represented: a compromise between necessity and prejudice. America needed every male combat pilot it could get on the front lines, which meant someone had to ferry the endless stream of new aircraft from factories to bases, from bases to ports, from ports to combat zones. Women could do that job, everyone agreed, but only that job. No guns, no combat training beyond the basics, no fighter tactics beyond escape and evade. Escape and evade. The doctrine was simple enough on paper. If bounced by enemy fighters, use your aircraft's speed to run. Climb if possible, dive if necessary, but get away and get home. Don't engage, don't fight back, don't try to be a hero. The assumption was that ferry pilots, lacking combat experience and flying alone, would be slaughtered in any engagement. Better to lose the aircraft and save the pilot. But the doctrine had a fatal flaw that became obvious the first time someone tried to follow it. German fighters were faster in a straight line than most aircraft being ferried, and they hunted in groups. Running meant being chased, and being chased by 6 aircraft meant 6 angles of attack, 6 sets of cannon, 6 chances to misjudge and die. The statistics bore it out. Ferry pilots who followed doctrine and ran had a survival rate barely better than those who panicked and froze. Zena Wilson had read those statistics during a sleepless night in the barracks at Sweetwater. She'd studied the after-action reports, the ones that made it back. And she'd come to a conclusion that would have gotten her grounded if she'd voiced it aloud. The doctrine was written by people who'd never been hunted. Zena's first memory wasn't of her mother's face or her father's voice. It was the smell of aviation fuel and hot metal, the particular sweetness of oil burning off an engine that had just been run too hard. She was 3 years old, sitting on a workbench in her father's hangar in rural Oklahoma, watching him rebuild a Curtis Jennings radial engine with the patience of a watchmaker and the strength of a blacksmith. Her father, Thomas Wilson, ran a crop dusting operation that barely kept the family fed during the Depression. He was a man who spoke more to engines than to people, who could diagnose a misfire by sound alone, who believed that every aircraft had a personality you had to learn before you could truly fly it. He taught Zena to read not with books but with maintenance manuals. By age 7, she could gap spark plugs. By 10, she could time a magneto. The first time she took the controls of an aircraft, she was 14. Her father had been contracted to dust a massive cotton field, but a summer flu had him bedridden. The farmer was threatening to hire someone else. Zena had watched her father fly 1,000 times, had sat in the cockpit during engine tests, had absorbed the rhythm of takeoff and landing through observation the way some children learned languages. She told her father she could do it. He was delirious with fever and desperate enough to believe her. She soloed that morning over Oklahoma cotton fields, the Stearman biplane bucking in the thermals like a living thing. She flew too low. She would always fly too low, feeling the ground effect cushion the wings, sensing the exact moment when the aircraft transitioned from ground vehicle to flying machine. She didn't think about what she was doing. She felt it, the way her father had taught her to feel the health of an engine through the vibration in the control stick. When she landed, the farmer paid in cash and her father said nothing, but she saw something in his eyes that might have been pride or might have been fear. Perhaps both. She'd learned to fly before she learned to drive, before she had her first kiss, before she understood that the world had opinions about what girls could and couldn't do. 3 years later, when the WASP recruitment posters appeared in town, Zena didn't see an opportunity for adventure or patriotism. She saw a chance to do the only thing she'd ever been good at, the only thing that had ever made sense to her, and get paid for it. The fact that it might get her killed was just another variable in the equation, no different than wind shear or fuel consumption. You calculated the risk and you flew anyway. Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas, was where the Army Air Forces sent women to prove they could fly military aircraft without killing themselves or embarrassing the service. The washout rate hovered near 40%. The training was deliberately brutal, not because the instructors were cruel, but because a mistake at altitude killed you just as dead whether you were male or female, and the Army needed pilots who could handle aircraft that were temperamental, overpowered, and built for men 50 pounds heavier. Zena arrived in the fall of 1943 with 200 other women, most of them college-educated daughters of privilege who'd paid for private flight lessons at country clubs. She had 6 years of crop-dusting muscle memory and calluses that wouldn't fade. The other trainees talked about duty and adventure during mess hall dinners. Zena ate quickly and studied the technical manuals, memorizing engine specifications and performance envelopes the way her father had taught her. The trouble started during her 3rd week, on a basic navigation exercise in a BT-13 Valiant. The instructor had briefed them to maintain 3,000 feet, follow the prescribed route, and return to base. Standard procedure. But Zena had noticed something during the pre-flight briefing, a weather system moving in from the west, the kind that would create turbulence at higher altitudes but leave the lower air relatively smooth. She dropped to 500 feet, using the terrain features for navigation instead of dead reckoning, and completed the course 4 minutes faster than any other trainee. Her instructor, Captain Morrison, a combat veteran with a distinguished flying cross and very little patience for improvisation, called her into his office that evening. "You were briefed to maintain 3,000 feet. Trainee Wilson. You flew at 500. Explain. She tried. She explained the weather, the turbulence, the visibility at low level, the time saved. Morrison listened with the expression of a man watching someone dig their own grave. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and said, "The Army doesn't need pilots who think they're smarter than their briefings. The Army needs pilots who follow orders. You pull another unnecessary low-level maneuver, you wash out." Understood. She said yes, sir, but she didn't understand. Or rather, she understood perfectly, she just disagreed. Flying by the book meant flying blind to conditions. It meant ignoring what the aircraft was telling you, what the air was doing, what your instincts screamed was the right choice. It meant being predictable. The write-up went in her file. Then another, 3 weeks later, for excessive maneuvering during a formation exercise. Then a third for flying a landing pattern that Morrison described as dangerously unorthodox. Each time, Zena listened to the lecture, accepted the reprimand, and filed it away with all the other opinions about what she couldn't or shouldn't do. She graduated in the middle of her class, not because she wasn't skilled, but because skill without obedience was considered a liability. Her final evaluation noted excellent technical proficiency, but warned of insufficient respect for doctrine. They gave her the silver wings anyway, because the war needed ferry pilots more than it needed perfect ones. The morning of June 17, 1944, broke clear and perfect over the English coast, the kind of weather that made ferry pilots grateful and nervous in equal measure. Good visibility meant easy navigation. It also meant you could be seen from 20 miles away. Zena had lifted off from an airfield outside Southampton at 0630 hours, one of 3 pilots ferrying P-51 Mustangs to a forward base in liberated France. The aircraft was fresh from depot maintenance, the Merlin engine running smooth and strong, the kind of machine that made you forget you were flying something that could kill you. Her navigation chart was marked with the approved route, a careful path that skirted known flak concentrations and kept them over Allied-held territory for as long as possible. They crossed the channel in a loose formation, maintaining radio silence except for position checks. The pilot to her left was Catherine Hayes, a former flight instructor from Connecticut who flew like she was giving a demonstration. The pilot to her right was Sarah Chen, 22 years old, 3 months out of Sweetwater. Both women were better at following procedures than Zena would ever be. They made landfall over Normandy at 0710 hours, the scarred beaches still visible below, then turned southeast toward their destination. The sky was empty of everything except sunlight and distance. Zena's eyes swept the horizon in methodical arcs, the way her father had taught her to watch for weather. You trusted the sky until it betrayed you, and then you died surprised. The first indication of trouble was a glint at 2 o'clock high, maybe 8,000 feet above them. Zena's hand moved to the radio transmit button before her conscious mind had processed what she'd seen. Bandits, 2 o'clock high. 6 contacts. Break formation. The radio crackled with acknowledgement and then chaos. The glints resolved into aircraft, Focke-Wulf 190s, dropping out of the sun in a textbook bounce. They'd been waiting, patient as spiders, positioned exactly where the ferry route intersected with contested airspace. Someone had done their homework. Zena shoved the throttle forward and broke hard left, the G-force pressing her into the seat. She saw Hayes climbing, following doctrine, trying to use the Mustang's altitude advantage. She saw Chen diving, panic, probably, but tactically sound. The German fighters split their formation with practiced efficiency, 2 peeling off after each target, which left 2 coming straight for Zena. She had maybe 10 seconds before they were in gun range. The fuel tanks were full, making the aircraft heavy and sluggish. She was unarmed, alone, and exactly where the hunters had wanted her to be. Every training instinct said climb, run, evade. Every survival instinct said something else entirely. Zena pushed the nose down and dove for the deck, watching the altimeter unwind like a clock running backward. 3,000 feet. 2,000. 1,000. The ground rose up to meet her, green French farmland quilted with hedgerows and stone walls. Behind her, the two Focke-Wulfs followed, their pilots probably grinning at the amateur mistake. They thought she was running. She was just getting started. At 500 feet, Xena leveled out and pushed the throttle to the firewall. The Merlin engine screamed, the propeller tips going supersonic with a sound like tearing canvas. She was low enough now that the ground blurred beneath her, individual trees and buildings registering as flashes of color in her peripheral vision. The airspeed indicator climbed past 300 miles per hour. Behind her, the two Focke-Wulfs stayed high for precious seconds, probably expecting her to level out, to preserve some margin for error. German fighter doctrine emphasized altitude as life. Altitude gave you options, gave you energy, gave you the ability to dictate the terms of engagement. Only a fool or a dead woman threw away altitude in enemy territory. Xena dropped to 200 feet. Then 100. The Mustang's wings flexed in ground effect, the air compressed between the aircraft and the earth, creating a cushion that made the controls feel different, heavier, more alive. This was the zone her instructors at Sweetwater had forbidden, the place where a moment's inattention meant cartwheeling through a farmhouse at 300 knots. The first German pilot committed, nosing down to follow her. She heard the rattle of cannon fire through the airframe before she saw the tracers, bright lines of light that stitched across a wheat field to her left, too far behind. He was leading the wrong amount, calculating for an aircraft at normal altitude where the air was thin and predictable. Down here, in the thick soup of surface-level atmosphere, the physics changed. Xena kicked the rudder and broke right, threading between two stone farmhouses so close she could see laundry hanging in a courtyard. The German pilot tried to follow and couldn't. His closure rate was too high, his angle too steep. He pulled up hard, trading his speed for altitude to avoid becoming a smoking crater in French farmland. The second pilot learned from his wingman's mistake. He stayed patient, matching her altitude, using his aircraft's superior roll rate to cut angles. Xena could see him in her mirror now, maybe 400 yards back, closing methodically. She had perhaps 30 seconds before he had a clean shot. Ahead, the terrain rose into a series of rolling hills covered in vineyards. She aimed for the lowest point between two ridges, a natural gap maybe 200 feet wide. At her speed, she'd clear it in under a heartbeat. The question was whether the German behind her would be stupid enough or skilled enough to try. She pulled back on the stick, just enough to clear the ridgeline by what felt like inches. The Mustang shuddered as it crested the hill, momentarily silhouetted against the sky. Then she pushed forward, diving down the opposite slope, using gravity to accelerate into the valley beyond. The second Focke-Wulf followed. But in the split second he was over the ridge, outlined against the sky, the other four German fighters, still at altitude, still hunting, saw him. More importantly, they lost sight of Xena. For just a moment, the hunters became confused about which shadow was prey and which was pack. That moment was all she needed. The clock had started. 3 minutes to survival or death. The valley opened into farmland divided by hedgerows, thick walls of earth and vegetation that French farmers had spent centuries building to mark property lines and windbreaks. From altitude, they were barely visible. At 60 feet, they were obstacles the size of buildings, appearing and disappearing as Xena wove between them at speeds that turned reaction time into pure muscle memory. She wasn't flying anymore. She was calculating trajectories in 3 dimensions, treating the landscape as a series of geometric problems that had to be solved in fractions of a second. Every barn, every tree line, every slight rise in terrain became a tool. The key was understanding what her pursuers could and couldn't see, and more importantly, what they couldn't predict. The second German pilot had closed to 300 yards, close enough that Xena could see the dark circle of his propeller hub in her mirror. He fired a burst, cannon shells that walked across a plowed field and then went wide as she jinked left around a stone church. The church tower was tall enough to create a momentary blind spot, 2 seconds where the German couldn't see her and had to guess which direction she'd brake. She broke right, using the church as a shield, then immediately dove even lower, 40 feet now, low enough that her prop wash kicked up dust devils behind her. When the German cleared the church, she wasn't where his gun sight predicted she'd be. He had to adjust, had to think, had to waste a second recalculating. That second was survival. But he was good. Veteran good. He compensated, cutting the angle, using his aircraft's tighter turn radius to close the gap. Xena saw him setting up for another shot and did something that would have gotten her court-martialed in any normal circumstance. She aimed straight for a barn. The barn was old timber and stone, maybe 40 feet tall, sitting at the base of a gentle hillside. She approached it head-on at full throttle, holding the course until the German pilot probably thought she'd lost her mind. At the last possible instant, maybe 50 yards out, she pulled back hard on the stick and snap-rolled right, clearing the barn's roof by a margin measured in feet rather than yards. The German pilot had 3 choices: pull up and lose all his speed and position, follow her roll and risk clipping the barn, or go under. He chose the first option, the smart option, the one that kept him alive. His Focke-Wulf climbed sharply, bleeding energy, creating separation. But separation meant time, and time meant the other German fighters were diving to rejoin the fight. Xena glanced up through her canopy and counted 4 distinct silhouettes dropping from altitude, fanning out to create a killing box. They were coordinating now, learning from their wingman's mistakes, adapting their tactics to this insane prey that treated the ground like a weapon. The geometry of the deck had bought her maybe 45 seconds. She needed to make it count, because the first ace had just overshot, but 5 more were learning fast. The Luftwaffe flew in swarm formations, a fluid, 4-aircraft tactical unit that had dominated the skies of Europe for years. 2 pairs of fighters, each pair covering the other, creating overlapping fields of fire that made attacking any one aircraft suicidal. It was elegant, proven, and utterly dependent on one critical assumption: altitude. At 6,000 feet, a swarm could maneuver freely, using speed and position to control the engagement. At 60 feet, they were flying in a phone booth with the walls closing in. Every maneuver had to account for the ground. Every turn risked a wingtip catching terrain. The formation that had made them lethal became a liability. Xena understood this in the same wordless way she understood when an engine was about to fail, not through analysis but through the accumulation of 1,000 small observations. She could hear it in the timbre of the German radio chatter, fragments of transmitted voices cutting through her headset. The panic wasn't in what they were saying but in how they were saying it. Short, clipped exchanges. Confusion about position. One voice, probably the Staffelführer, the squadron leader, trying to restore order to a hunt that had become chaos. She dove into a narrow valley carved by a stream, the terrain rising on both sides like the walls of a canyon. 2 German fighters followed her in, one high on the left ridge, one lower trying to match her altitude. The 3rd and 4th stayed above, trying to maintain an overwatch position. The swarm was splitting, coming apart at the seams. The fighter on her left tried to cut across the valley to get an angle. Xena turned into him, not away, but toward, forcing him to choose between collision or breaking off. He broke, pulling up hard, and in doing so crossed directly in front of his wingman's gun line. For maybe 2 seconds, the Germans were aiming at each other, not at her. She reversed the turn, banking so hard that the G-forces grayed her vision at the edges. The Mustang responded like it was part of her nervous system, rolling into the new heading with a precision that Captain Morrison would have grudgingly acknowledged. She was now flying perpendicular to the valley, heading straight toward a hillside covered in dense forest. The lower German fighter tried to follow the turn and couldn't. His aircraft had the roll rate but not the turning radius at this speed and altitude. He went wide, overshooting, his closure rate carrying him past her 3-9 line. For a moment, he was in front of her, target instead of hunter. If she'd had guns, she could have killed him. Instead, she climbed sharply, using the hillside as cover, and when she crested the ridge she was heading northeast, while the Germans were still sorting themselves out in the valley behind her. The swarm had become 4 individual aircraft hunting on instinct rather than discipline. But individual hunters were still deadly, and she'd just run out of terrain. Ahead, the land flattened into open farmland with nowhere to hide. The temperature gauge caught her attention first, a needle climbing into the red zone faster than physics should allow. Then came the smell, sweet and acrid, glycol coolant vaporizing as it leaked from somewhere in the engine compartment. She'd taken a hit after all, probably during one of those canyon runs when she'd been too focused on the Germans to notice the impact of a single shell. The Merlin engine ran on liquid cooling, a system that worked brilliantly until it didn't. Once the coolant was gone, the engine had maybe 3 minutes before it seized completely. She glanced at the temperature gauge again and revised that estimate down to 2 minutes. Maybe less. Behind her, 3 German fighters had regrouped and were closing fast, no longer bothering with fancy tactics. They'd learned their lesson about low-altitude games. Now they were simply running her down in open sky, using speed and patience. She could see them clearly now, maybe half a mile back, holding formation, waiting for the kill shot. Ahead, through the heat shimmer rising from the engine cowling, she spotted the airfield, a forward Allied base carved out of farmland, with a single dirt runway and a handful of tents. It was maybe 5 miles away. She had perhaps 90 seconds of engine life left and 30 seconds before the Germans were in gun range. The mathematics didn't work. She pulled the throttle back to idle, killing the power before the engine could destroy itself. The sudden silence was overwhelming. No more roar, just the whistle of wind over the canopy and the distant, fading sound of German radial engines. The Mustang transformed from powered aircraft to glider, still flying but sinking, trading altitude for distance in a ratio that gravity dictated and she couldn't change. The Germans saw the engine failure and accelerated, sensing the end. They were maybe 400 yards back when her wheels touched dirt, the Mustang bouncing once on the rough runway before settling with a jolt that rattled her teeth. She had just enough momentum to coast off the runway and into a revetment before the aircraft stopped completely. The German fighters pulled up sharply as they crossed the airfield perimeter, unwilling to tangle with the anti-aircraft guns that had suddenly opened up from ground positions. They climbed back to altitude, reformed their swarm, and disappeared to the east. Xena sat in the cockpit for a long moment, hands still gripping the control stick, watching the temperature gauge slowly descend as the dead engine cooled. Her flight suit was soaked with sweat. Her arms trembled with fatigue. When she finally unbuckled and climbed out onto the wing, her legs barely held her weight. A ground crew sergeant approached, looking at the scorched engine cowling and the bullet holes stitched across the tail section. He glanced at Xena, then back at the aircraft, then at the sky where the Germans had disappeared. "Ma'am," he said finally, "what the hell did you just do?" Xena didn't have an answer. She'd survived 3 minutes that should have killed her, using tactics that violated every regulation she'd been taught. She'd brought in a crippled aircraft with no engine power and 6 German aces trying to kill her. What she'd done was impossible, which meant it must have been necessary. The intelligence report arrived at SHAEF headquarters 3 days later, forwarded through channels that typically dealt with strategic bomber losses and fighter pilot kill claims. It was 4 pages of German radio intercepts, translated and annotated, documenting a failed interdiction mission over northern France on June 17, 1944. The intercepts told a story that seemed, to the analysts reading it, almost fantastical. 6 Luftwaffe fighters, all piloted by aces with verified kills ranging from 12 to 34, had engaged a single Allied aircraft in what should have been a routine bouncing of a ferry pilot. The engagement lasted 3 minutes and 7 seconds. In that time, 2 German aircraft had crashed attempting to follow their target through terrain. A third had suffered engine damage from flying through debris kicked up by the target's prop wash. The remaining 3 had broken off the attack, with radio traffic indicating tactical reassessment, rather than the usual ammunition depletion or mechanical failure. The target aircraft had been identified through cross-reference with Allied ferry schedules. AP-51D Mustang, serial number 44 to 13761, piloted by WASP trainee Zena Wilson, age 20. The aircraft had landed at a forward base with battle damage, a seized engine, and an empty fuel tank. The pilot had filed a routine after-action report describing evasive maneuvers at low altitude and successful delivery of assigned aircraft. What she hadn't mentioned, what the intelligence officers had to piece together from German transmissions and witness statements from ground observers, was that she'd turned a slaughter into a masterclass in terrain masking. That she'd forced veteran pilots to make mistakes by exploiting the one domain where their experience became a liability. That she'd done what every WASP was told was impossible. She'd fought back without firing a single shot. The report concluded with a recommendation that Wilson's tactics be studied for potential incorporation into escape and evasion training. It noted that her unorthodox approach, while effective, violated multiple regulations regarding minimum safe altitude and adherence to approved ferry routes. It suggested a commendation for successful aircraft delivery under hostile conditions, balanced against a formal reprimand for unauthorized tactical maneuvers. The report was filed, classified, and forgotten by everyone except the pilots who heard about it through the unofficial channels that connected every airfield in the theater. They didn't care about regulations or recommendations. They cared that a 20-year-old rookie in a WASP flight suit had made 6 German aces look like student pilots on their first solo. Word spread. Stories grew. Some said she'd shot down 2 Germans with her prop wash alone. Others claimed she'd flown inverted through a barn. The details varied, but the core remained consistent. The girl they'd nicknamed Too Low Wilson back at Sweetwater had proven that altitude was a choice, not a requirement, and that sometimes the best weapon wasn't what you carried but what you understood. Zena heard the stories and said nothing. She knew the truth was simpler and more terrifying than any legend. She'd survived because she'd been willing to die on her own terms rather than theirs. Everything else was just geometry and nerve.